Dearest listeners, there exists in the annals of proper society a most curious phenomenon. How often we overlook the most precious treasures whilst pursuing mere glittering baubles. Today, your humble chronicler brings you such a tale. Before we turn the first page, do consider showing your favor for this chronicle with a like so and not subscribing, so that you never miss a chapter. The most engaging conversations are to be had in the parlor below, so I eagerly await your comments. And now, to the story of two sisters. But let us not rush, for true worth, like the rarest of diamonds, is often found in the most unexpected settings. The spring of 1818 had arrived in London with all the pomp and circumstance that the ton demanded of its marriage mart. Amongst the drawing rooms of Mayfair, where mothers surveyed their daughters like generals planning campaigns, stood the elegant townhouse of Sir Reginald Thornwick, a gentleman of modest fortune but impeccable lineage. Within those tastefully appointed walls lived two sisters whose destinies would become the subject of considerable speculation throughout the season. Miss Seraphina Thornwick, at 6 and 20, possessed the unfortunate distinction of being what society cruelly termed quite upon the shelf. She had endured 4 seasons with the patience of a saint and the dignity of a queen, watching as suitor after suitor approached with genuine interest, only to retreat in bewildering haste after making the acquaintance of her family. There was nothing wanting in Seraphina's appearance. Her chestnut hair caught the light with golden highlights, her gray eyes held depths of kindness that would have moved poets to verse, and her figure, whilst not fashionably slight, possessed an elegant grace that spoke of noble breeding. Her accomplishments were precisely what one would expect of a gentleman's daughter. She spoke French and Italian with fluency, played the pianoforte with genuine feeling rather than mere technical precision, and possessed a knowledge of literature that extended far beyond the Gothic novels deemed suitable for young ladies. More remarkably, she had developed an extraordinary ability to navigate the treacherous waters of social conversation, steering discussions away from dangerous shoals with the skill of an admiral. Miss Persephone Thornwick, 4 years her junior, had been blessed by Providence with the sort of classical beauty that caused sonnets to be written and duels to be fought. Her golden curls framed features that seemed carved by a master sculptor, whilst her blue eyes sparkled with an intelligence that was immediately apparent to all who met her. She possessed the same accomplishments as her sister, but displayed them with a confidence that bordered upon the theatrical. When Persephone played the pianoforte, it was performance. When she spoke French, it was demonstration. When she entered a room, it was conquest. Yet there existed within Miss Persephone a most peculiar defect of character, one that would have been deemed impossible in so lovely a creature, had not numerous witnesses attested to its veracity. She possessed an unerring ability to find fault with everything and everyone, coupled with an irresistible compulsion to voice these criticisms with surgical precision. It was as though she viewed the world as a manuscript requiring extensive correction, and herself as the only qualified editor. The Thornwick parents, Sir Reginald and Lady Margaret, observed their daughters with the myopic affection common to devoted families. They saw Persephone's criticism as evidence of her superior intellect and discerning taste, while Seraphina's attempts to moderate these observations were viewed as mere sisterly concern. That 4 seasons of suitors had approached their elder daughter only to disappear with suspicious suddenness was attributed to Seraphina's advancing age and perhaps overly fastidious standards. The truth, known to every servant in the household but somehow invisible to the family, was that Persephone's tongue was sharper than any blade forged in Sheffield. She could reduce a confident gentleman to stammering uncertainty with a single observation about his cravat's arrangement. She questioned fortunes with the thoroughness of a solicitor, corrected classical references with the authority of an Oxford Don, and critiqued horseflesh with the expertise of a Tattersall's auctioneer. Lady Margaret, a woman of considerable social ambition, despite modest circumstances, had convinced herself that Persephone's spirited conversation was precisely what would attract a gentleman of consequence. Sir Reginald, whose attention was generally occupied with his botanical studies, trusted his wife's judgment in matters of matrimony, while secretly hoping that both daughters would find suitable establishments before his modest estate was further strained by the expenses of London seasons. The servants, however, possessed a clarity of vision denied to their employers. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper who had been with the family since the girls were in leading strings, often remarked to the cook that Miss Seraphina had the patience of a blessed martyr. The footman developed an unconscious habit of announcing gentlemen callers with expressions of sympathy, as though delivering news of an impending execution. Seraphina herself had long since ceased to harbor illusions about her romantic prospects. She had observed the pattern with scientific precision. A gentleman would be introduced at some social gathering, would request permission to call, would arrive with obvious enthusiasm, would meet Persephone, and would subsequently discover urgent business that required his immediate departure from London. The most optimistic interpretation was that these gentlemen found themselves overwhelmed by preference for her sister. The more realistic assessment was that they fled in terror of what marriage into the Thornwick family would entail. She had developed a philosophy of resignation that was both dignified and practical. If Providence had ordained that she should remain unmarried, she would dedicate herself to becoming the finest aunt in Christendom once Persephone achieved her inevitable brilliant match. She would maintain her father's household with competence and grace, correspond with literary friends, perhaps even attempt to have some of her translations published, though naturally under a masculine pseudonym. Only in the silence of her chamber, late at night, did she sometimes permit herself a single weary sigh for the life that might have been, before recomposing her serenity for the new day. This state of resigned acceptance had settled over Seraphina like a comfortable if somewhat melancholy cloak when the name of Lord Caspian Ravencrest, Viscount Silvermere, began to circulate through the drawing rooms of Mayfair with the intensity of a summer storm. He was, by all accounts, precisely the sort of gentleman that mothers of marriageable daughters prayed would appear. 30 years of age, possessed of a considerable fortune derived from both inheritance and shrewd investment, and bearing a military reputation that had earned him the respect of his peers and the government alike. Lord Caspian had served with distinction in the peninsula, where his tactical brilliance had been matched only by his personal courage. Wellington himself had been heard to remark that Ravencrest possessed the sort of clear-thinking pragmatism that won battles and saved lives. Upon selling his commission following Napoleon's final defeat, he had applied these same qualities to the management of his estates, which flourished under his careful attention. Society whispered that he had finally decided to take a wife, having reached that age when even the most confirmed bachelor begins to consider the necessity of securing the succession. The fact that he had remained unmarried despite numerous opportunities had only added to his desirability. Here was a gentleman who had not been trapped by some scheming miss or forced into marriage by debt or scandal. As February gave way to March and the season began in earnest, speculation about Lord Caspian's intentions reached fever pitch. It was known that he had taken a house in Grosvenor Square for the season, had ordered new carriages, and had been seen consulting with the most fashionable tailors. Clearly, he intended to approach the marriage mart with the same methodical preparation that had served him so well in military campaigns. When it became known that he had expressed particular interest in meeting the acclaimed Miss Persephone Thornwick, Lady Margaret nearly swooned with delight. Here, at last, was a suitor worthy of her younger daughter's extraordinary qualities. A gentleman whose fortune and position would provide the perfect stage for Persephone's undeniable brilliance. The Countess of Pembroke's ball had long been considered the unofficial opening of each London season, and the gathering on the evening of March 15th promised to surpass even her ladyship's usual standards of magnificence. Pembroke House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, their glow reflecting off crystal chandeliers that had been transported from Venice at considerable expense. The ballroom, decorated in the Egyptian style that had become fashionable since Nelson's victories, featured gilded columns and hieroglyphic motifs that would have impressed Cleopatra herself. The melody of a chamber orchestra mingled with the hum of hundreds of conversations, and the air was thick with the heat of so many souls and the combined scent of beeswax, rice powder, and the hothouse flowers that adorned every cornice. Lady Margaret had spent the better part of a week preparing for this crucial evening. Persephone's gown, ordered from the most exclusive modiste in Bond Street, was a creation of celestial blue silk that perfectly complemented her golden beauty. Every detail had been considered. The sapphires at her throat had belonged to Sir Reginald's grandmother. Her gloves were of the finest French kid, and her dancing slippers had been crafted by an artist who shod the feet of royalty. Serafina, attired in a becoming but noticeably less elaborate gown of deep green silk, had long since accepted her role as supporting player in her sister's theatrical performances. She carried herself with quiet dignity, knowing that her purpose this evening was to provide appropriate background for Persephone's inevitable triumph. Her own appearance, whilst attractive, had been calculated to enhance rather than compete, a decision that spoke volumes about her character and her understanding of family dynamics. The Thornwick family arrived fashionably late, their modest carriage joining the impressive queue of vehicles depositing the cream of society at Pembroke House's magnificent entrance. As they ascended the grand staircase, Lady Margaret's eyes darted about the crowd, searching for any sign of the gentleman who had occupied her thoughts for weeks. Lord Caspian Ravencrest chose an observation point near the refreshment tables. The location offered a clear view of the entrance, walls to protect his flanks, and two distinct routes of retreat should conversation become a siege maneuver. His gray eyes, accustomed to assessing terrain and enemy positions, now surveyed the marriage mart with similar analytical detachment. He had come this evening with a specific objective: to be introduced to the famous Miss Persephone Thornwick, whose beauty and accomplishments had been the subject of considerable correspondence from his sister, Lady Charlotte Pemberton. Charlotte, safely married these 5 years and therefore qualified to offer matrimonial advice, had written enthusiastically about Miss Persephone's extraordinary qualities. When the Thornwick family was announced, a subtle ripple of attention swept through the ballroom. Persephone's entrance was everything that romance novels proclaimed such moments should be. Heads turned, conversations paused, and more than one gentleman felt his heart rate accelerate appreciably. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of a queen acknowledging her subjects, her smile radiant but carefully controlled to suggest both warmth and appropriate reserve. Serafina followed at a discreet distance, her own grace evident to those few observers not completely mesmerized by her sister's spectacular beauty. She possessed the sort of quiet elegance that grew more appealing upon closer acquaintance, though such subtle charms were easily overlooked in the presence of Persephone's more obvious attractions. Lady Charlotte Pemberton, sister to the coveted Lord Caspian, approached the Thornwick family with obvious pleasure. She was a sensible woman who had married for both affection and advantage, and now enjoyed the comfortable position of one whose own matrimonial success qualified her to facilitate similar happiness in others. The introductions were performed with all the ceremony that such an important moment demanded. Lord Caspian bowed with military precision whilst mentally cataloguing his first impressions of the lady who might become his Viscountess. Miss Persephone was indeed as beautiful as advertised, possessing the sort of classical features that would grace a family portrait admirably. Her curtsy was perfectly executed, her manner appropriately modest yet confident. What he had not anticipated was the almost immediate commencement of what could only be described as an interrogation disguised as conversation. Within moments of their introduction, Miss Persephone had managed to inquire about the source of his fortune, the management of his estates, his political affiliations, and his opinion on the current government's handling of post-war economic difficulties. Whilst these topics were not inappropriate for social discourse, the manner of their presentation suggested a barrister cross-examining a witness rather than a young lady making polite conversation with a potential suitor. Each question was accompanied by subtle challenges to his responses, corrections to his casual observations, and implications that her superior understanding of these matters qualified her to judge the adequacy of his answers. Lord Caspian, accustomed to the direct communication favored by military men, initially found this forthright approach refreshing after seasons of insipid small talk about the weather and the theater. However, as the conversation progressed, he began to detect an edge to Miss Persephone's discourse that was less refreshing than unsettling. When he mentioned his appreciation for the excellent horses in his stable, she observed that she had heard his cattle were adequate, though perhaps not of the first quality. When he referenced a recent agricultural improvement on his estates, she corrected his terminology with the authority of a land agent. When he made a casual literary allusion, she not only completed the quotation, but proceeded to critique the author's lesser-known works with devastating precision. Throughout this increasingly uncomfortable exchange, Lord Caspian became aware of another presence, Miss Seraphina, who remained nearby with the patience of a guardian angel. He noticed how she attempted to soften her sister's more pointed observations, how her eyes reflected genuine mortification at each particularly sharp comment, and how she possessed an almost supernatural ability to redirect conversation towards safer channels whenever Miss Persephone appeared ready to launch particularly devastating criticisms. When Miss Persephone decided to enlighten him regarding the inferior quality of the evening's musical arrangements, citing specific deficiencies in the orchestra's string section, Lord Caspian observed Miss Seraphina's subtle intervention. Without appearing to contradict her sister, she managed to guide the conversation toward appreciation of Lady Pembroke's overall hospitality, the beauty of the floral arrangements, and the evident happiness of the assembled guests. Her voice, when she spoke, possessed a musical quality that was both soothing and intelligent. She made observations that demonstrated genuine wit without requiring victims, showed familiarity with the same literary works that her sister wielded like weapons, and displayed knowledge of social graces that enhanced rather than diminished the comfort of others. As the evening progressed and Lord Caspian requested the honor of dancing with Miss Persephone, he found himself curiously conscious of Miss Seraphina's presence among the watchers lining the ballroom. During the patterns of the country dance, Miss Persephone continued her peculiar combination of beauty and criticism, managing to comment unfavorably upon the dancing master's choreography, the inadequate spacing between couples, and the questionable musical interpretation provided by the orchestra. When supper was announced and Lord Caspian offered his arm to escort Miss Persephone to the dining room, he was surprised to find himself hoping that Miss Seraphina would be seated within conversational range. There was something about her presence that seemed to create islands of calm in the tempestuous seas of her sister's social discourse. The supper itself provided fresh opportunities for Miss Persephone to demonstrate her critical faculties. The removes were declared adequate, though hardly inspired. The wines were pronounced acceptable, but hardly exceptional, and the service was observed to lack the precision one might expect from a household of Pembroke's standing. Each criticism was delivered with such authority and conviction that nearby diners began to question their own positive impressions of what had previously seemed a delightful evening. Lord Caspian, seated beside this fountain of disapprobation, found his attention increasingly drawn to Miss Seraphina, who was engaged in quiet conversation with an elderly gentleman about botanical illustrations. Her discussion revealed both genuine knowledge and an ability to draw out her companion's expertise whilst appearing genuinely interested in his observations. The contrast with her sister's performance could not have been more striking. As the evening drew to its close and the final dances were called, Lord Caspian performed his social obligations with the automatic precision that had served him well in military service. He secured Miss Persephone's hand for another dance, complimented Lady Margaret on her daughter's accomplishments, and made appropriate noises about the pleasure of the family's acquaintance. Yet as his carriage rolled through the gaslit streets toward Grosvenor Square, his thoughts remained curiously occupied, not with the acknowledged belle of the evening, but with her quieter sister. There had been something about Miss Seraphina's gentle competence, her obvious intelligence combined with genuine kindness, that lingered in his memory like a half-remembered melody. The morning following Lady Pembroke's ball dawned grey and drizzly, perfectly matching Lord Caspian's somewhat confused state of mind as he attempted to make sense of his contradictory impressions of the previous evening. His usual methodical approach to decision-making seemed inadequate when applied to the complex dynamics he had observed within the Thornwick family. Miss Persephone was undeniably beautiful, accomplished, and intelligent, precisely the qualities he had determined were essential in a future viscountess. Her knowledge exceeded that of most young ladies. Her confidence suggested she would be comfortable managing a large household and extensive social obligations, and her striking appearance would certainly enhance his family's reputation. These were practical considerations that should have led to immediate action. Yet, something about the evening had left him feeling unsettled, as though he had attended a performance rather than enjoyed genuine social intercourse. Miss Persephone's conversation, whilst undoubtedly intelligent, had possessed an edge that reminded him uncomfortably of certain superior officers whose competence was undermined by their compulsion to demonstrate that competence at every opportunity. More puzzling still was his persistent memory of Miss Seraphina, whose presence had seemed to provide the only moments of genuine pleasure in an otherwise exhausting evening. Her quiet grace and obvious kindness had created small oases of comfort amidst the desert of her sister's relentless criticism. Social convention demanded that he follow proper protocol regarding his interest in Miss Persephone. Accordingly, he composed a formal note requesting permission to call upon the family, timing his message to arrive during the fashionable morning hours when such communications were expected. The response from Lady Margaret was gratifyingly enthusiastic, suggesting that his attentions would be most welcome. The Thornwick household in Portman Square presented an appearance of modest prosperity when Lord Caspian arrived for his first formal call. The house, while smaller than the grand mansions favored by families of the first consequence, was elegantly appointed and bore evidence of refined taste within reasonable financial constraints. He was shown into a drawing room that combined comfort with fashionable decor, where the family awaited his arrival with obvious anticipation. Lady Margaret had orchestrated the scene with theatrical precision. Miss Persephone, attired in a morning dress of jonquil yellow that complemented her golden beauty, was positioned near the pianoforte where her accomplishments could be displayed to advantage. Miss Seraphina, dressed more simply in dove gray, had been placed near the window where her presence would enhance the domestic tranquility without competing for attention. The conversation that ensued confirmed Lord Caspian's previous observations whilst adding new dimensions to his understanding of the family's dynamics. Miss Persephone launched immediately into what could only be described as a comprehensive critique of the previous evening's entertainment, dissecting everything from the quality of the refreshments to the competence of the servants with the exhaustive detail of an auditor. Her observations were undoubtedly accurate. Lord Caspian had sufficient experience of society to recognize genuine discernment when he encountered it. Yet the relentless negativity began to weigh upon his spirits like a physical burden. Every topic introduced seemed to provide fresh opportunities for disapprobation. Every subject offered new evidence of inadequacy in the wider world. Sir Reginald cleared his throat, seeing a pause. "Speaking of fine works, Lord Ravencrest, a new monograph on the hybridization of orchids," he began hopefully, only to be cut off by his wife's gesture towards the pianoforte. "Persephone, my dear, perhaps his lordship would appreciate a musical demonstration rather than gardening." When Lady Margaret suggested that Miss Persephone demonstrate her musical accomplishments, the performance that followed was technically flawless, but accompanied by a detailed commentary on the inferior quality of the instrument, the inadequate tuning provided by the piano tuner, and the compromises required by the limited acoustical properties of the room. Throughout this display, Lord Caspian found his attention repeatedly drawn to Miss Seraphina, who listened to her sister's performance with apparent enjoyment, whilst occasionally wincing at particularly pointed criticisms. When invited to add her own musical contribution, she demurred with such genuine modesty that her reluctance seemed to spring from consideration for others rather than false humility. The conversation moved to literature, where Miss Persephone's extensive reading provided ammunition for devastating attacks upon authors whose work had generally been well received by critics and public alike. Byron was dismissed as melodramatic, Scott as repetitive, and even the sainted Dr. Johnson was found wanting in various particulars. Miss Serafina's contributions to these discussions revealed a mind equally well-informed, but possessed of a fundamentally different character. Where her sister found flaws, she discovered merit. Where criticism seemed inevitable, she offered balanced assessment that acknowledged both strengths and limitations. Her observations demonstrated the same level of education and intelligence, but applied with charity rather than judgment. When the subject turned to current events and Lord Caspian mentioned his concerns about agricultural conditions following the recent poor harvests, Miss Persephone immediately corrected his understanding of grain prices, questioned his sources of information, and suggested that his experience was perhaps too limited to support reliable conclusions. Miss Seraphina, observing his obvious discomfort, managed to redirect the conversation toward more constructive channels whilst acknowledging the validity of his concerns. Her questions about estate management revealed genuine interest rather than desire to demonstrate superior knowledge, and her comments suggested both intelligence and empathy for the difficulties faced by those dependent upon agricultural prosperity. As the visit progressed, Lord Caspian began to feel as though he were participating in some elaborate test rather than enjoying normal social intercourse. Every observation was challenged, every opinion was questioned. Every casual remark was subjected to scrutiny that would have been more appropriate in Parliament than in a lady's drawing room. The strain of maintaining appropriate responses to this barrage of criticism began to tell upon his nerves. His military training had prepared him for hostile interrogation by enemy forces, but he found himself increasingly bewildered by similar treatment from a young lady who was supposedly interested in securing his matrimonial attentions. Miss Seraphina's obvious distress at her sister's behavior provided the only relief in an otherwise exhausting interview. Her attempts to moderate Miss Persephone's more pointed observations whilst maintaining family loyalty demonstrated a delicacy of feeling that was both admirable and touching. When the prescribed duration for morning calls had elapsed, Lord Caspian took his leave with expressions of gratitude that were perfectly correct but notably lacking in enthusiasm. As his carriage conveyed him away from Portman Square, he found himself questioning his original assessment of Miss Persephone's suitability as a potential bride. Her beauty remained undeniable, her accomplishments were impressive, and her intelligence exceeded that of most young ladies of his acquaintance. Yet the prospect of enduring such systematic criticism for the remainder of his natural life seemed daunting even to a man who had faced Napoleon's artillery with equanimity. More troubling still was his growing consciousness of Miss Seraphina's very different qualities. Her quiet competence, gentle humor, and obvious kindness created an atmosphere of peace that seemed increasingly precious as he contemplated the alternative. The following days brought additional social encounters that confirmed these initial impressions whilst adding new dimensions to his understanding of both sisters. At a Venetian breakfast hosted by Lady Jersey, Miss Persephone managed to find fault with the entertainment, the refreshments, the company, and the weather with such thoroughness that other guests began to avoid their party. Miss Seraphina, meanwhile, engaged in conversations that left her companions feeling more intelligent, more interesting, and more valued than they had upon arrival. Her ability to draw out the best in others whilst never appearing to seek attention for herself demonstrated a social grace that was both rare and precious. During a visit to the theatre, Miss Persephone's commentary upon the performance, whilst perhaps accurate in its technical assessments, proved so distracting that other patrons began to express their displeasure with increasingly obvious gestures. Miss Seraphina's mortification at her sister's behavior was evident to anyone possessed of ordinary powers of observation, yet she continued to defend her family with loyal discretion. At each social gathering, Lord Caspian found himself seeking opportunities to observe Miss Seraphina more closely. Her quiet dignity in the face of her sister's embarrassing behavior, her genuine interest in others, and her ability to find pleasure in simple social interactions despite the constant tension created by Miss Persephone's critical commentary, all combined to create an impression of character that was both appealing and admirable. Fortune, as Lady Ravenswood had long observed, possessed a most particular sense of timing when it came to matters of the heart. It was therefore with something approaching divine irony that the crucial moment of understanding between Lord Caspian and Miss Seraphina should occur not in the refined atmosphere of a Mayfair drawing room, but in the somewhat less elevated setting of Hatchard's bookshop in Piccadilly. Lord Caspian had developed the habit of visiting the celebrated establishment on Wednesday mornings, when society was generally occupied with other pursuits, finding in the quiet perusal of new publications a refuge from the demanding schedule of social obligations that the season required. On this particular morning in early April, he had arrived seeking a recently published volume on agricultural improvement, his practical mind ever occupied with methods of enhancing his estate's productivity. He discovered, to his considerable surprise, Miss Seraphina Thornwick standing before the shelves devoted to classical literature, her attention entirely absorbed by a handsomely bound edition of Plutarch's Lives. She was quite alone, a circumstance so unusual for a young lady of breeding that he approached with some concern for her welfare. She started slightly upon recognizing him, a becoming flush coloring her cheeks as she realized the impropriety of her unaccompanied presence in a gentleman's domain. Yet there was no artifice in her obvious pleasure at seeing a familiar face, and her explanation for her solitary expedition revealed both her character and her circumstances with touching clarity. Miss Seraphina had, she confessed with endearing embarrassment, conceived a passionate desire to acquire this particular translation of Plutarch, having exhausted the resources of the circulating library in her search for scholarly works that treated ancient history with appropriate gravitas rather than romantic embellishment. Her modest quarterly allowance had finally accumulated sufficient funds for this extravagance, but the expedition had required careful timing to avoid her family's well-intentioned but restrictive supervision. Lord Caspian found himself charmed by this glimpse into her private interests and touched by the lengths to which she had gone to pursue her intellectual curiosity. Here was a young lady who valued learning for its own sake, rather than as mere accomplishment to be displayed in drawing rooms, and whose financial constraints had taught her to appreciate simple pleasures with genuine gratitude. When he discovered that she was also seeking a particular botanical text for her father's research, having memorized the precise title and publisher from Sir Reginald's careful instructions, his admiration for her filial devotion increased considerably. The patience with which she searched through volumes that held no personal interest, her meticulous attention to her father's specifications, and her obvious pleasure in anticipating his happiness demonstrated qualities of character that were both rare and precious. As they moved through the shop together, propriety somewhat relaxed by the scholarly atmosphere and the presence of other respectable patrons, Lord Caspian discovered depths to Miss Seraphina's mind that had been invisible in the formal settings of their previous encounters. Her knowledge of literature was extensive and genuine, unmarred by any desire to demonstrate superiority or correct others' opinions. She discussed authors and ideas with the enthusiasm of a true scholar, whilst maintaining the modesty appropriate to her station. More significantly, he began to understand the true burden she carried within her family. Her careful economy, with her limited funds, her obvious concern for her father's comfort, and her patient endurance of circumstances that would have driven a lesser character to rebellion, all spoke of a strength masked by gentle compliance. When she mentioned, with characteristic self-deprecation, her amateur attempts at translation work, Lord Caspian's interest was immediately engaged. Miss Seraphina had, it emerged, been quietly working on English versions of several French treatises on agricultural science, hoping to make these valuable resources available to English landowners who lacked facility with foreign languages. Her description of these efforts revealed both scholarly competence and practical understanding of farming concerns that impressed him considerably. She had consulted extensively with her father and his steward, had corresponded with agricultural societies, and had approached the work with systematic thoroughness that would have credited a professional translator. The conversation that followed was the first genuine exchange Lord Caspian had enjoyed since beginning his pursuit of matrimonial arrangements. Miss Seraphina's questions about estate management sprang from intellectual curiosity rather than desire to challenge his competence, and her observations demonstrated both intelligence and practical sense. As they discussed various approaches to crop rotation, soil improvement, and livestock breeding, he found himself appreciating not only her knowledge, but her manner of expressing it. She listened with obvious interest to his experiences, asked thoughtful questions that revealed understanding rather than skepticism, and offered insights that enhanced rather than undermined his own observations. The hour they spent in Hatchards passed with unprecedented swiftness, unmarked by any of the tension that had characterized his previous encounters with the Thornwick family. Miss Seraphina's company proved both stimulating and restful, challenging his mind whilst soothing his spirits in ways that he had not experienced since his military days, when honest communication among officers had been essential for survival. When he offered to escort her home, propriety required that she decline, yet her obvious reluctance to end their conversation was as gratifying as it was apparent. They parted with expressions of pleasure at their chance encounter and hopes for future opportunities to continue their discussion of subjects of mutual interest. During the carriage ride to Portman Square that Lord Caspian had discreetly arranged to follow at a distance sufficient to ensure Miss Seraphina's safe arrival without compromising her reputation, he found himself reviewing the morning's events with growing amazement. For the first time since beginning his campaign to secure Miss Persephone's hand, he had enjoyed unqualified pleasure in female society. Miss Seraphina's combination of intelligence, kindness, and genuine interest in others created an atmosphere of comfortable intimacy that was entirely new to his experience. Her lack of artifice, her obvious consideration for others' comfort, and her ability to discuss serious subjects without displaying superiority or seeking to diminish others' contributions, all suggested qualities that would enhance rather than complicate domestic happiness. More troubling still was his growing awareness that these virtues were precisely what had been missing from his interactions with Miss Persephone. Beauty, accomplishment, and intelligence were admirable qualities in a wife, but without kindness and consideration, they might prove insufficient foundations for matrimonial content. That evening, as he prepared for yet another social engagement where he would be expected to advance his suit with Miss Persephone, Lord Caspian found himself anticipating instead the possibility of encountering Miss Seraphina. The prospect of her gentle presence seemed increasingly precious as he contemplated the likely alternative of another evening devoted to systematic criticism of everything and everyone in their vicinity. He began, quite unconsciously, to evaluate Miss Persephone's behavior against the standard established by her sister's very different approach to social interaction. Where Miss Persephone found fault, Miss Seraphina discovered merit. Where one sister diminished others, the other enhanced their comfort and confidence. Where criticism flourished, kindness bloomed. The realization that he had perhaps been pursuing the wrong sister crept upon him gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape previously obscured by darkness. Yet social convention and his own publicly declared intentions created complications that could not be easily resolved. The grand musical soirée hosted by the Dowager Duchess of Marlborough promised to be the social event of the season, featuring performances by the most celebrated artists currently gracing London's cultural landscape. The invitation itself, written upon paper embedded with gold leaf and sealed with the ducal arms, conveyed the magnitude of the honor bestowed upon those fortunate enough to be included in Her Grace's select company. Lord Caspian approached the evening with considerable anticipation, though his thoughts were occupied less with the promised entertainment than with the hope of securing private conversation with Miss Seraphina. The events at Hatchards had confirmed his growing conviction that he had been directing his matrimonial attentions toward the wrong sister, and he had spent considerable time contemplating how best to rectify this error without causing unnecessary scandal or distress. The Thornwick family arrived in their accustomed formation, Lady Margaret beaming with satisfaction at securing such a prestigious invitation, Sir Reginald appearing somewhat overwhelmed by the magnificent surroundings, and both daughters dressed to complement their respective roles in the evening's anticipated drama. Miss Persephone had selected a gown of ivory silk adorned with seed pearls that transformed her into a vision of classical perfection. Every detail of her appearance had been calculated to inspire admiration, From the artful arrangement of her golden curls to the strategic placement of her grandmother's diamond necklace. She moved through the Duchess's staterooms with the confidence of one accustomed to conquest. Miss Seraphina, attired in a gown of deep blue silk that brought out the gray of her eyes whilst maintaining appropriate modesty, possessed a quiet elegance that enhanced rather than competed with her sister's more obvious attractions. Her appearance spoke of refined taste within reasonable constraints, and her obvious pleasure in the evening's cultural offerings suggested a mind capable of genuine appreciation rather than mere social display. The evening's entertainment commenced with a performance by Madame Catalani, whose extraordinary vocal range had made her the toast of European opera houses. The assembled company listened with the reverential attention due to genuine artistry, and even Miss Persephone appeared temporarily silenced by the magnificence of the soprano's interpretation of Mozart's most challenging arias. During the interval that followed this musical triumph, Lord Caspian seized the opportunity to approach the Thornwick family with intentions of securing Miss Seraphina for the promenade around the Duchess's famous gallery. However, social convention and Lady Margaret's ambitious expectations combined to frustrate his carefully laid plans. The appearance of Sir Basil Featherstone, a gentleman of advanced years and considerable fortune who had recently lost his third wife, provided an unexpected complication to the evening's proceedings. Sir Basil, whose previous matrimonial ventures had been motivated primarily by financial considerations, had apparently decided that Miss Persephone's beauty and accomplishments qualified her to become the fourth Lady Featherstone. His approach to courtship reflected the practical methodology that had served him well in commercial enterprises. He positioned himself strategically near the refreshment tables where interception of his quarry was virtually guaranteed, armed himself with intelligence gathered from various sources regarding the lady's interests and circumstances, and prepared to launch his campaign with the systematic thoroughness of a military operation. When he engaged Miss Persephone in conversation, her response demonstrated all the characteristics that had begun to concern Lord Caspian during their previous encounters. Sir Basil's attempts at gallantry were dissected with forensic precision. His compliments were returned with corrections, and his efforts to demonstrate his cultural sophistication were met with devastating observations regarding his obvious limitations. Yet Sir Basil, seasoned by 3 previous matrimonial campaigns and fortified by the comfortable awareness of his substantial bank balance, proved surprisingly resistant to discouragements that would have routed younger, less experienced suitors. He appeared to interpret Miss Persephone's criticism as evidence of her discriminating taste rather than as personal attacks, and his responses suggested either remarkable obtuseness or admirable persistence. Lord Caspian observed this exchange with feelings of profound relief mingled with growing determination to secure Miss Seraphina's company before other complications arose. However, his approach was intercepted by Lady Margaret, who had interpreted Sir Basil's interest in Miss Persephone as potential threat to more elevated matrimonial prospects. Her ladyship's whispered conference with Lord Caspian was both urgent and revealing. She expressed confidence that his lordship would not permit a mere baronet, however wealthy, to interfere with superior claims to her daughter's hand. The assumption that his intentions toward Miss Persephone were both serious and exclusive was stated with such conviction that contradiction seemed impossible without creating immediate scandal. Meanwhile, Miss Seraphina had found herself in conversation with young Lady Pemberton, who had approached her with obvious pleasure at discovering a kindred spirit among the evening's sophisticated company. Their discussion of the evening's musical program revealed Miss Seraphina's genuine appreciation for artistic excellence, combined with knowledge that enhanced rather than diminished others' enjoyment. Later, Lady Charlotte found her brother near the gallery. "Caspian," said she in low tones, with a thoughtful expression, "I believe in my letters I may have praised the wrong gem. The elder Miss Thornwick. There is a brilliance there of far superior quality." When the second portion of the evening's entertainment was announced, featuring a performance by a promising young pianist whose debut had been eagerly anticipated by musical connoisseurs, the assembled company returned to their seats with appropriate expectation. The young artist, Miss Catherine Westbrook, was a lady of gentle birth whose family's reduced circumstances had necessitated her public performance for financial support. Her appearance on the stage was greeted with the polite attention due to her breeding, though her obvious nervousness suggested that the pressure of performing before such distinguished company was considerable. Her interpretation of a challenging Beethoven sonata began with promise, demonstrating both technical competence and musical sensitivity. However, as the performance progressed, her anxiety began to affect her execution, and several minor errors crept into passages that required absolute precision. The audience's response was initially charitable, recognizing both the difficulty of the music and the performer's evident distress. However, Miss Persephone's reaction to these imperfections proved catastrophic for all concerned. Her comments, though whispered, were delivered with sufficient clarity to be heard by those in nearby seats. She observed that the performer's technique was obviously inadequate for such ambitious repertoire, that her musical interpretation lacked sophistication, and that her presence on the stage reflected poorly upon the evening's overall standards. These criticisms, harsh enough when delivered privately, became devastating when Miss Persephone's voice carried further than intended. Miss Westbrook, already struggling with performance anxiety, heard sufficient fragments of this commentary to become completely unnerved. The result was a cascade of increasingly serious errors that transformed what might have been a minor imperfection into a musical disaster. The young performer's distress became obvious to the entire audience, and her eventual collapse into tears created a moment of profound embarrassment for all present. The Duchess's response was swift and decisive. She rose from her seat with the majesty of offended royalty and approached the distraught performer with expressions of sympathy and support. Her public validation of Miss Westbrook's courage in attempting such challenging music, combined with criticism of certain individuals whose lack of charitable feeling disgraced the evening, left no doubt regarding her opinion of Miss Persephone's behavior. Miss Serafina's reaction to this crisis was both immediate and revealing. Without regard for social convention or personal consequences, she rose from her seat and approached the stage with obvious intention of providing comfort to the distressed performer. Her public display of compassion, delivered with quiet dignity that enhanced rather than diminished its effectiveness, provided striking contrast to her sister's demonstrated cruelty. Lord Caspian watched this scene with emotions that ranged from admiration for Miss Serafina's moral courage to profound dismay at Miss Persephone's public revelation of character flaws that could no longer be overlooked or excused. The evening concluded with unprecedented awkwardness, the assembled company departing with obvious relief whilst whispering comments that boded ill for the Thornwick family's social standing. Miss Persephone's reputation had suffered damage that would require considerable time and effort to repair, whilst Miss Serafina's demonstration of genuine nobility had earned widespread admiration. Yet the most significant consequence of the evening's events was Lord Caspian's final recognition that his matrimonial intentions had been fundamentally misdirected from their inception. The morning following the Duchess's disastrous soirée dawned upon a London society buzzing with the sort of gossip that could elevate or destroy reputations with equal facility. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair, over morning chocolate and fresh correspondence, the events of the previous evening were dissected with the thoroughness of natural philosophers examining specimens under magnifying glasses. The consensus was swift and merciless. Miss Persephone Thornwick had revealed herself to possess a character fundamentally unsuited to the elevated society she aspired to join. Her public cruelty toward a lady in distressed circumstances, combined with her apparent indifference to the suffering she had caused, marked her as someone whose presence would be unwelcome in houses where genuine refinement was valued above mere accomplishment. Conversely, Miss Serafina's immediate and public response to the crisis had demonstrated qualities of character that elevated her considerably in social estimation. Her willingness to risk her own standing in order to provide comfort to a stranger spoke of moral courage that commanded universal admiration among those whose opinions mattered. Lord Caspian spent the morning hours in his study, ostensibly reviewing correspondence from his steward, but actually contemplating the fundamental alterations that the previous evening's revelations had wrought in his understanding of the Thornwick family. The contrast between the sisters' responses to Miss Westbrook's distress had crystallized observations that had been accumulating throughout their acquaintance. Miss Persephone's beauty remained undeniable, her accomplishments impressive, and her intelligence considerable. Yet these advantages were undermined by a fundamental flaw of character that rendered them not merely insufficient, but actively dangerous to domestic tranquility. The prospect of enduring a lifetime of systematic criticism, of watching his friends subjected to her merciless judgment, of seeing his future children raised under the influence of her caustic temperament, seemed not merely unappealing but genuinely alarming. Miss Seraphina, meanwhile, possessed qualities that had revealed themselves gradually but with increasing clarity. Her intelligence was equal to her sister's, but tempered with wisdom. Her observations were astute, but delivered with kindness. Her knowledge was extensive, but displayed without ostentation. More importantly, her instinctive response to others' distress demonstrated a compassionate nature that promised to enhance rather than complicate family happiness. The realization that he had wasted precious weeks pursuing the wrong sister while the right one remained unattached and apparently unaware of his growing regard created a sense of urgency that military training had taught him to recognize and act upon. Yet the delicate nature of his situation required careful navigation to avoid creating scandal that might damage Miss Seraphina's reputation, whilst failing to secure her affections. His first consideration was the need to extract himself from the implicit understanding that existed regarding his intentions toward Miss Persephone. Social convention and his own publicly demonstrated interest had created expectations that could not be simply abandoned without explanation. Lady Margaret's assumptions, Miss Persephone's obvious anticipation of his proposal, and society's observation of his attentions all combined to create obligations that honor demanded he address directly. His second and more pressing concern was the possibility that Miss Seraphina might interpret his transfer of affections as either fickleness or expedience. Having observed her loyalty to her family despite considerable provocation, he recognized that she might view his change of preference as evidence of character flaws that would make him unworthy of her regard. The complexity of these considerations was further complicated by Miss Seraphina's apparent resignation to spinsterhood and her obvious assumption that her romantic prospects had been permanently damaged by her sister's behavior. Her gentle acceptance of what she perceived as inevitable disappointment demonstrated admirable philosophy, but created additional obstacles to successful courtship. Lord Caspian's contemplation of these difficulties was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor whose presence added new dimensions to an already complex situation. Sir Basil Featherstone, apparently undaunted by the previous evening's revelations, had arrived with obvious intention of advancing his matrimonial suit despite the damage to Miss Persephone's reputation. Sir Basil's persistence reflected either remarkable obtuseness or calculating pragmatism. He had, he explained with characteristic directness, sufficient fortune to overcome minor social difficulties, and Miss Persephone's beauty remained undiminished by her unfortunate display of temperament. Indeed, he confessed with startling honesty, he rather preferred wives who possessed sufficient spirit to manage household affairs without requiring constant supervision. This revelation provided Lord Caspian with unexpected relief, whilst simultaneously creating new concerns. Sir Basil's interest in Miss Persephone might resolve the immediate difficulties regarding his own withdrawal from that quarter, but the prospect of Miss Seraphina being subjected to such a brother-in-law seemed almost as distressing as the alternative. However, Sir Basil's next communication proved even more surprising than his matrimonial persistence. He had, he revealed, been in conversation with young Lady Pemberton, who had approached her with obvious pleasure at discovering a kindred spirit among the evening's sophisticated company. Their discussion of the evening's musical program revealed Miss Seraphina's genuine appreciation for artistic excellence, combined with knowledge that enhanced rather than diminished others' enjoyment. His proposal was characteristically practical. If his suit with Miss Persephone proved successful, He would be delighted to provide Miss Seraphina with a permanent home and position as companion to his new wife. Her presence would provide beneficial influence upon Miss Persephone, whilst ensuring that her own future was secured despite her advancing age and limited matrimonial prospects. Lord Caspian's response to this well-intentioned but thoroughly inappropriate suggestion required considerable self-control. The image of Miss Seraphina reduced to dependence upon her sister's charity, subjected to Miss Persephone's daily criticism whilst managing Sir Basil's household affairs, seemed a fate worse than any Gothic novel had conceived. Yet Sir Basil's obvious confidence that his proposal would be welcomed revealed the general assumption that Miss Seraphina's options were indeed limited to such expedients. The recognition that society viewed her as a woman whose time had passed, whose romantic prospects had been permanently damaged by circumstances beyond her control, strengthened Lord Caspian's determination to offer her alternatives that would restore both her independence and her happiness. After Sir Basil's departure, Lord Caspian spent considerable time crafting a letter that would address the immediate necessities whilst preparing the ground for future action. His communication to Lady Margaret was masterfully diplomatic, expressing continued regard for the family, whilst gently indicating that recent events had led him to reconsider the wisdom of pursuing formal arrangements at the present time. The letter managed to convey withdrawal without insult, disappointment without discourtesy, and concern for the family's welfare without condescension. His suggestion that perhaps time might allow recent difficulties to resolve themselves provided face-saving explanations, whilst making clear that his previous attentions should not be considered as creating ongoing obligations. More importantly, the letter created opportunities for future communication with the family without the specific focus upon Miss Persephone that had previously constrained his interactions. His expressed hope that their acquaintance might continue on terms of general friendship opened possibilities for approaching Miss Seraphina directly, whilst maintaining appropriate respect for family sensibilities. The response to this communication arrived with gratifying promptness and proved both relieving and encouraging. Lady Margaret's reply, whilst expressing appropriate disappointment at his withdrawal, demonstrated understanding of his position and gracious acceptance of his decision. More significantly, her invitation to continue their acquaintance suggested that the family's doors would remain open to his future visits. The month of May had always held particular significance in Lord Caspian's military experience, as it marked the season when campaigns traditionally commenced and destinies were determined through decisive action. It was therefore with something approaching tactical precision that he planned his approach to the delicate matter of securing Miss Seraphina's affections whilst avoiding the social complications that might arise from his recent withdrawal from her sister's vicinity. Fortune provided the perfect opportunity in the form of Lady Charlotte Pemberton's garden party, an annual celebration that brought together the most refined elements of society in an atmosphere of relaxed elegance that encouraged genuine conversation rather than formal display. The extensive grounds of Pemberton House, renowned for their magnificent botanical collections, provided numerous secluded alcoves where private discourse might be conducted without impropriety. Miss Seraphina attended the gathering with obvious pleasure, her appreciation for natural beauty evident in her careful observation of the rare specimens that Lady Charlotte had collected from around the globe. Her knowledge of botanical science, acquired through years of assisting her father's research, enabled her to engage in informed discussion with Lord Pemberton's gardeners, whilst displaying genuine interest in their expertise. Lord Caspian approached her during her examination of a particularly fine collection of roses, their conversation beginning with shared appreciation for the gardener's skill before developing into more personal channels. Miss Seraphina's initial surprise at his obvious preference for her company gradually gave way to cautious pleasure as she recognized the sincerity of his interest. Their discourse ranged over subjects that revealed the compatibility of their minds and temperaments. She spoke with evident knowledge about agricultural improvements, demonstrating understanding that would prove invaluable in managing large estates. Her observations about social responsibility reflected moral principles that aligned perfectly with his own convictions regarding the obligations that accompanied privilege. More significantly, Her questions about his military service revealed genuine interest in his experiences rather than mere polite attention. Her understanding of strategic principles, gleaned from extensive reading, enabled her to appreciate the complexities he had faced, whilst her sympathy for the human costs of warfare demonstrated sensitivity that touched him deeply. As they walked through the gardens, Lord Caspian found himself explaining not merely the facts of his campaigns, but the philosophical reflections that service had inspired. Miss Seraphina's responses revealed a mind capable of grasping complex moral questions whilst maintaining practical understanding of necessary compromises. When the conversation turned to domestic matters, her views on family life, the education of children, and the management of households demonstrated principles that promised harmonious partnership rather than competition. Her evident pleasure in others' happiness, combined with her practical competence, suggested qualities that would enhance rather than complicate married life. The crucial moment arrived when Lord Caspian, recognizing both opportunity and necessity, requested permission to speak privately regarding matters of importance to both their futures. Miss Seraphina's initial confusion gave way to amazement as he began to explain the evolution of his feelings and the recognition that his previous attentions had been misdirected. His declaration was delivered with military frankness, tempered by genuine emotion. He confessed that acquaintance with her family had taught him to distinguish between mere accomplishment and true worth, between surface brilliance and genuine intelligence, between critical facility and wise judgment. Miss Seraphina's response revealed the depth of her own feelings whilst maintaining the modesty appropriate to her station. She had, she confessed, observed his obvious preference for her sister while struggling with her own growing admiration for his character. Her assumption that his attentions to Miss Persephone precluded any possibility of his interest in herself had led her to guard her own feelings with care that had not prevented their development. The mutual recognition of shared regard and compatible principles led naturally to more formal declarations. Lord Caspian's proposal was delivered with sincere conviction of Miss Seraphina's worth, whilst acknowledging the obstacles that their union might face from those who failed to appreciate her true value. For a moment she hesitated, her heart torn between overwhelming joy and genuine concern. "But my lord," she whispered, her voice laden with heartfelt worry, "what of your honor, society? What will they say of such a change of affection?" Miss Seraphina's acceptance, when it came after his fervent reassurances, was given with touching gratitude, combined with clear understanding of the responsibilities that would accompany her new position. Her evident pleasure in the prospect of partnership rather than dependence, her obvious relief at escaping the limited options that spinsterhood represented, and her genuine affection for the man who had recognized her worth, all combined to create a moment of perfect understanding. The announcement of their engagement created responses that ranged from surprise through approval to barely concealed envy among those who had failed to perceive Miss Seraphina's attractions. Lady Charlotte's immediate endorsement provided important social validation, whilst the support of other discerning members of society gradually overcame initial bewilderment at Lord Caspian's unexpected choice. Miss Persephone's response to her sister's triumph proved surprisingly gracious, perhaps influenced by Sir Basil's persistence in pursuing his own matrimonial objectives despite recent setbacks. On the evening when the engagement was announced to the family, Persephone approached her sister. Without her customary critical tone, she simply said, "He sees you, sister. Pray ensure that he continues to do so." It was the closest approximation to a blessing that she could offer. Her engagement to the determined baronet was announced shortly thereafter, their union representing a pragmatic alliance that promised to satisfy his need for a decorative wife whilst providing her with the social position and financial security that her beauty deserved. The double wedding that followed was celebrated with appropriate magnificence, though the contrast between the bride's respective circumstances could not escape observation. Miss Persephone's union was marked by material splendor that reflected Sir Basil's considerable fortune, whilst Miss Seraphina's marriage was distinguished by the evident happiness of both parties and the genuine warmth of well-wishers who recognized true affection. Lady Margaret's satisfaction at seeing both daughters advantageously settled overcame any lingering disappointment at the unexpected nature of the arrangements. Sir Reginald's pleasure in acquiring a son-in-law who shared his intellectual interests, whilst possessing the practical competence to implement agricultural improvements, provided additional compensation for the departure from original expectations. The establishment of the new Lady Ravencrest at Silvermere Park proved everything that her husband's discernment had predicted. Her management of household affairs combined efficiency with consideration for others' welfare, whilst her social position enabled her to provide assistance to neighbors and dependents with characteristic generosity. Her translation work, now pursued with the support of resources adequate to her scholarly interests, gained recognition among agricultural reformers, whilst her correspondence with learned societies established her reputation as a contributor to useful knowledge. The marriage that had begun with mutual recognition of compatible principles developed into partnership that enhanced both parties' capabilities whilst providing the domestic happiness that had been the object of their union. The children who blessed their marriage inherited their mother's gentle wisdom combined with their father's practical competence, whilst the annual visits from their aunt, Lady Featherstone, provided amusing reminders of alternatives that had been fortunately avoided. Miss Persephone's marriage to Sir Basil proved as successful as such pragmatic arrangements could be expected to achieve. His imperviousness to criticism protected him from her sharper observations, whilst her beauty and social graces enhanced his position in society sufficiently to satisfy his ambitious requirements. The moral of their history was not lost upon observers whose own matrimonial prospects required careful consideration. True worth, as the wisest among them recognized, often resided in qualities that escaped casual observation, while surface attractions might conceal fundamental incompatibilities that would undermine domestic tranquility. The transformation of Miss Seraphina from overlooked spinster to happily married viscountess provided encouragement to other ladies whose modest circumstances had limited their opportunities, whilst Lord Caspian's recognition of genuine merit over obvious accomplishment established him as a gentleman whose judgment could be trusted in matters beyond mere military service. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, rewarding patience and wisdom, whilst teaching the discerning to look beyond surface attractions in their pursuit of true happiness. The greatest treasures, as those who seek them with proper understanding eventually discover, are often hidden in plain sight, awaiting only eyes capable of recognizing their true value.